When I was in my mid-30s, I decided one afternoon when Rose and I were visiting my family in South Jersey that we should make a left turn instead of a right and go back to the street where I lived from the time I was 8 to 13. And I hadn't been there in about 20 years. And when we turned onto 2nd Street in Franklinville, we got out of the car, and perhaps you've had this experience before. It was one of the strangest experiences I ever had. I got out, and I was physically dizzy for about 10 minutes easily. It was hard to keep my balance. And the reason I was so dizzy was because I was disoriented, because the street was so small. And in my mind, my reality in my head of what I knew of this street, which I knew really well because I lived there for 8 years, did not match what my eyes were telling me. And I couldn't get the reality of what I was seeing to come back into focus with what I remembered for at least 10 minutes. This is Transfiguration Sunday. And I looked up the word transfiguration in the Greek, and the Greek is metamorpho. And the meta part is to change. And morpho is the part that I thought was more interesting. Means for the inner essence of something to be transformed into the outer reality. So the inside is changed to look like the outside, which is what was going on, I guess, for me in my mind, standing on that street. And it's also what's going on for the disciples with Jesus today. The teacher that the disciples followed up that mountain was somebody that they'd been spending time with for at least a year or two. And they'd eaten with him. I'm sure that they'd slept together by campfires. They'd listened to him teach. They watched him walking. They saw him talking. They knew his mother and his siblings. They knew the town where he grew up. They had an idea that they had a good grasp on who Jesus was. And then they go up on this mountaintop, and suddenly, which happens a lot on mountaintops in the Bible, by the way, if you have a mountaintop experience, you have this epiphany, and suddenly, instead of the guy that the disciples at this point I think have probably come to believe they know, here he is standing with the most important prophets in the Old Testament, Moses and Elijah. And not only is he standing with them, but he is blinding like the sun. He is so filled with light. When he is transfigured in front of them, they can't even gaze upon him. And so this man, Jesus, who they had a sense that they pretty well knew, is completely transfigured in front of them, and I'm sure disorients them, because they realize that this person, Jesus, is so filled with God that he's impossible to even gaze upon. It's too much. And when the disciples have this experience, Peter turns to Jesus and says, "Lord, it's good for us to be here. Let me build 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah." If you've heard me preach before, you know I always looked at Peter to say the stupid thing that I would say. That's kind of who he is in the gospel. He's always the guy who comes up with the wrong thing to say at the wrong time. This time, though, I'm completely on his side. I think he might have said the right thing. Because to me, when he says that he would like to build a dwelling for Moses, Elijah, and Jesus, I think he's remembering a story in Exodus that coincidentally the folks at the Bible study on Friday mornings, the Grace Bible study, are reading right now. And the story is about when Moses is called by God up to yet another mountaintop, and God tells Moses, in the middle of the wilderness, the wandering out of Egypt into the land of freedom, God tells Moses, I want you to build a dwelling place for me. I want you to build a tabernacle. Tell the people to use all of the finest things they have, all their gold and all their silver and all of their jewels and all of their silk. And he gives this very specific explanation of what he wants built, a tent of dwelling, so that the people of Israel in the middle of their wilderness wandering will understand that God dwells with them. And one could ask, as we did, how are the people of Israel supposed to get jewels and gold and silver and silk and all this fancy stuff in the middle of the wilderness wandering? They're just trying to get by eating manna and hoping they have enough water to get through the day. Where are they going to get all this great stuff? And the rabbis have an answer. I love the rabbis for this reason. The rabbis say, remember when the people left Egypt, one of the things that happened was the Egyptians handed over, all the wealthy Egyptians, handed over all their silver and gold and jewels and silk, all of their finery. They handed it to the Israelites on their way out of Egypt. And as I listen to the Transfiguration story, I think that maybe in the Exodus, what's going on is that we used to, as the Israelites, associate all the fineries of the world with people who are powerful, right? All of the glory and splendor of the world belongs to the rich and the powerful. And maybe what happens when God tells Moses to build a tabernacle is the Israelites take all of that stuff that they associate with the rich and powerful, and they reorient themselves to where power in the world really is by building a dwelling place for God. That the true splendor and power of the world is not to be found in the empires, but in the presence of God among us. And so the people of Israel build this tent, and I'll bet you anything, Peter for once must have been paying attention in Sunday school because he remembered this story. He remembered this story about Moses having the people of Israel build these tents. So he turns to Jesus and asks, what about it? Should we build you a dwelling place up here on the mountain to understand how God will be among us? But when he asks this question, the epiphany disappears. And suddenly Moses and Elijah are gone, and it's just Jesus again. But even though that vision has disappeared, something has changed forever. And the thing that's changed is not Jesus, because what Jesus has shown them is who he really is. So it's not Jesus who has changed, but it's the disciples have completely become reoriented in a new way to who Jesus is. And they see in him something completely new. And perhaps as Jesus is walking with them back down the mountain, maybe they don't say it out loud, but I bet they're thinking, they understand that the real dwelling place of God, that tabernacle that the Israelites once built in the wilderness, isn't made out of silk and jewels and silver anymore. The dwelling place of God is this man who they are walking back down the mountain with, towards Jerusalem now, where he's going to suffer and die. But they see in Jesus the reality of God dwelling among them in a way they didn't understand it before they went up that mountain. So it's not Jesus who has changed. Of course, it's them. When they go back down, everything has changed for them. And now, when they go back to their lives, whatever they were, whether it was their hopes for the future or where they were going to eat or sleep, or thinking about what's going to happen tomorrow, and all people that they meet and the strangers that they see in the street, instead of just seeing them individually as people and turning to Jesus kind of as a great teacher to help them get through the world, I bet you their lives are turned upside down, and now they see everybody and their own hopes and dreams and their thoughts about the future through the lens of Jesus. Now everything goes through the lens of who he is to them. We come to church each Sunday, and in the Episcopal Church, like in other churches where sacrament is most important, we come to this table and there's bread and there's wine. And something mysterious happens when we break the bread and share it and declare the presence of God. Somehow we know that God is really with us, changing us. And perhaps when we fail to be fully alive to what's going on in communion, we can get to the point where we think church is a refuge from the world, where we think that the world out there is profane and unholy, and in here, in this church where the bread and the wine are, where we gather for worship, this is the place where it's holiness, so we come here to escape. But in reality, when we get reoriented through the bread and the wine, what we realize is that God's presence in this church reorients us to the fact that Christ is out there. We become reoriented and we understand everything again through the lens of Jesus. I almost think of the bread and the wine as that sign at the mall that says, you have the picture of all the different stores, and then there's that arrow. And the arrow points down at you and says, you are here. We come into the church so we don't get lost in that wilderness. Christ is present. God has come to dwell among us once and for all. And Jesus reaches out at each one of us, as he did in the gospel today, and says, don't be afraid. You are not lost. Amen.